So this is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of cybernetics and the origin of information. We are picking up from page 137 of the translation. So we're in the chapter, the mixed origin of information. So this is maybe the most abstract of the chapters that we've read. So he's sort of, rather than analyzing specific theories or devices that cyberneticians have put together, in previous chapters he talked about like the homeostat and the mechanical tortoise and all these things. We don't have as many of those types of examples in this chapter. He's instead looking more at some of the concepts involved in talking about information in the first place, and he connects some of these questions to a kind of problem that runs through more or less the whole history of philosophy, which is trying to understand the origin of novelty. How is it possible that there could be something new in the world? And the reason this is a problem, or might seem like a problem, is that if we want to give an explanation for where this novelty comes from, it seems we have to connect that new phenomenon with something that was there before this new phenomenon, some sort of pre-existing state or potential or whatever it is you want to call it. But then if you say this new thing is sort of explained by something that existed before that new thing arose, then you're kind of like eliminating the newness of the new thing. You're saying, this pre-existing state, had sort of written in it already the capacity to bring about this new phenomenon, even if we weren't aware of it, or it's something that wasn't obvious. It was still there at that time, prepared in advance. And if we had a better knowledge, if we had a better knowledge of that initial state, we could have predicted that this new or seemingly new phenomenon would arise later on. So this explanation of the new phenomenon seems to kind of eliminate its newness. But then the other sort of option, if you sort of want to hold on to the newness of the new phenomenon, seems to make it impossible to explain, like to give a sort of rational account of the emergence of this phenomenon. It seems you have to like sort of accept this kind of inexplicability or irrationality of the world, that there can just be some new thing arise, and it there's no way of explaining how it emerged from something that existed before that phenomenon. And so he sort of classifies different philosophers in terms of which of these options they pick, and how, like, there's sort of sub varieties in terms of how they want to explain the arising of the new phenomenon from the pre-existing one, or what type exactly of novelty they're sort of insisting on, etc. And we could probably, given that it's a very sort of schematic account of the history of philosophy, where you have these sort of small set of categories that you're assigning all these different philosophers to, it's obviously an oversimplification, and you could probably identify some like mixed cases where philosophers would sort of combine answers to these questions in ways that try to sort of overcome this difficulty. Like maybe certain new phenomena are explicable and certain other ones are not, etc. You could think of many different variations of how you could try to combine these answers in more complicated ways. But in any case, there does seem to be this kind of like fundamental difficulty in accounting for something new as both explicable or rationally comprehensible, and also as new, and not as sort of pre-written. And this mirrors the controversy in the history of embryology between the pre-formationists and the epigeneticists. So these were sort of two different schools in like 17th, 18th century embryology. And then so the pre-formationists held that the embryo contains the adult organism more or less in miniature. There's various ways of sort of maybe more sophisticated ways of expressing that, but the idea is that like everything is kind of there already in the embryo, and it's just a matter of growth, quantitative growth, or sort of filling in the schema or something like that. And there are some obvious difficulties that arise for this in, for example, accounting for hybridization. How is it that like a horse and a donkey can mate to produce a mule, you have to sort of presuppose that like it was already sort of pre-written in the destiny of this horse and donkey that their offspring would like not be purely horse or purely donkey. Like it was sort of like predestined that they would mate, which seems not very credible. And then yeah, the other side, the epigenesis, sort of insisted on the actual emergence of the structures of the adult organism in development. So it's not the case that the organs and differentiated structures of the adult are already there in the embryo. They have to actually develop. But then the big problem for the epigenesis account is how do you explain that a chicken embryo generally develops into a chicken and not an oak tree or I don't know, a dog or whatever, any other possible organism, that there is this regularity that there is a kind of pattern to the way that this embryo develops. If it's just sort of this novel production of structures, it's hard to understand why those novel structures would always develop or generally develop in this regular manner. So yeah, there's this sort of debate between these two schools, and each of them had some pretty strong arguments against the other. Um, and yeah, but given that they each had these arguments against each other, it was hard to say that one is like clearly better than the other. It seems that they're each accounting for some real aspect of development, but that they're not really grasping the whole picture of development, given that they each have these arguments against each other. And so this is, yeah, again, the same kind of problem as the more abstract philosophical one of the emergence of novelty. And so Ruyer is going to try to sort of overcome this, multi-thousand year history of philosophy problem. He wants to give us an account of yeah, the emergence of novelty here would be understood in terms of I guess selection of values. So we're dealing with this realm, this extraspatial realm of values, and an organism in developing is a kind of selection of a value, and this is analogous to the way that a person might select a value to guide their behavior. You might, you can think of, important moral decisions where you're sort of thinking about values in an explicit sense, but even very kind of trivial decisions, you decide, oh, I'm going to brush my teeth before I go to bed or whatever. You're sort of, you are, by virtue of brushing your teeth before you go to bed, you're sort of realizing the value of, I don't know, protecting the health of your teeth or something. I mean, it's kind of a trivial value, but just by acting in a certain way and not in another way, you're sort of implicitly acknowledging that some way of acting is better than another one, and so you're responding to this sort of differentiation of values. And Ruyer wants to sort of present the development of an embryo as analogous to this, responsiveness to values, in the sense that the embryo develops in a certain way and not another and not in another way. It's similar in character to the way that a human acts in one way and not another way. So sometimes Ruyer writes in such a way that he seems to be attributing something like a mind to the embryo, that like there's like the embryo is deciding to develop in a certain way. I'm not sure that's sort of his like official picture of what what he's arguing for. But in any case, he's arguing that this analogy is a good one. That the development of organisms is analogous to psychological entities like human beings making a decision to act in a certain way. But yeah, so we still haven't gotten the full picture of how this solves the problem of novelty, but we'll get there. Okay, so we can pick up from page 137 at the section break, the heading, Ambitious Cybernetics and Effective Cybernetics.
Okay, I can read. Ambitious Cybernetics and Effective Cybernetics. With respect to the Myersonian dilemma, The cybernetics that adopts totalitarian mechanistic postulates, which we will call ambitious cybernetics, belongs to the first rationalist group among the monist mechanist theories. It has all the blatant insufficiencies. But cybernetics, as pure technics stripped of its pretensions, is instead an admirable illustration for the understanding of the mixed origin of information. Let us consider again the privileged case of astronautics. Albert Ducrocq has profoundly emphasized the particularly important role that questions of scale play. A spacecraft, by virtue of the law of mass ratio, is inconceivable below a certain minimal dimension that probably represents several thousand tons. This necessary enormity will create serious implementation difficulties. To illustrate his point, Ducrocq uses a very telling comparison. Suppose that organic evolution had resulted not in an intelligent vertebrate, such as the human, but some intelligent ants, who would have built the civilization in a limited corner of the earth, for example in Cornwall. These ants, with the help of machines of their size or of the same scale, would have explored all of England. Then, with the aid of telescopes, they would have been able to discover in the distance the neighboring islands and even the coasts of the continent. But to cross the sea, they would need to build boats that are big enough to withstand the waves, gigantic compared to their own dimensions, and equipped with equally gigantic engines. The steering, like the construction of these boats and their motors, would only have been possible for them through stages of relays and servo motors. A miniature instrument panel could only have directly commanded automated systems, which alone would have been able to operate the gigantic engines. This image is more than just an image, because man, faced with atomic energy and the plan to focus on an interplanetary rocket, is in exactly the same situation as an ant faced with the combustion engine and the boat to cross the seas. In both cases, the development of cybernetics and automata is an essential condition of success. Calculating machines, servo mechanisms, and feedback are indispensable for allowing humanity to continue its conquest of the organisms themselves, at least those larger than viruses, were only possible through automations and relay. An adult man, relative to an initial cell, is even more gigantic than a 10,000-ton spaceship relative to an adult man. The entire macroscopic physiology of multicellular organisms represents a group of power machines controlled by the intermediary of information machines. Organic forms are already the result of a mix of faith or axiological tensions, combined with the technical channeling of macroscopic physical laws. It is therefore not surprising that physiologists have so much to borrow from mechanistic cybernetics, but it is no less evident that they are wrong if they believe they can cross the line and dogmatize about these mechanical relays. If the mechanist theories of the invention of forms are absurd with respect to astronautics, they're also absurd, and for exactly the same reason, with respect to the physiology of organisms. Effective cybernetics, detached from ambitious cybernetics, then appears as what it really is, an auxiliary of life and conscious intention, indissociable from life and consciousness. I'll stop there because the whole section. I understand his point here that the use of things like relays and servo mechanisms are necessary not only for using large and complex technology like spaceships, cars, obviously, or boats if you're an ant, I guess. And also, relays and servo mechanisms enable in some way, the human being to control its own body. But this kind of, to me, points to something we talked about in a previous reading group session, which was that kind of the relationship, how exactly we go from kind of my experience of the world, this first personal true form, to the control by that truth through relays of the body is not totally clear to me. Like where the part of what Ruyer is saying here is that the body is mechanistic, at least in part. So how exactly the mechanistic part links up to the axiological part is obscure to me.
Yeah. So on that last point, I think when we discussed this a while ago, I had suggested that the answer to that question in part is a question of physiology rather than of philosophy that, if you want to understand the sort of true form of the human body, you would be looking at like all the sorts of regulation processes involved in the human body preserving its temperature, and the different chemical differentials across a cell membrane, for example, all these sort of processes that keep a human body alive. Um, and that is not sort of a specifically philosophical task. You would be like, doing very typical sort of physiology experiments about, how a cell preserves a chemical gradient across its or a chemical differential across its membrane, for example, whatever, things like that are not themselves intrinsically philosophical sort of questions. But I do think, yeah, there is maybe a need for an account of sort of in principle how you get sort of across this boundary between this hyperspatial world of values and the spatial world of the mechanisms by means of which those values are realized. I'm not sure if he has a sort of general account of how that works, and rather than a sort of case by case account of how a specific value is realized by a specific grouping of mechanisms. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that's enough. If you can sort of get away with just saying that each of these processes involves different mechanisms that realize different values, or if you need a general account of how do you get from like how do values even sort of regulate, how do they even connect with the mechanisms in such a way that a mechanism can be the realization of a value. Yeah, I'm not really sure where I would land on that question. I think this bit about the ants it's kind of a funny image of like ants building themselves a boat to cross the ocean. But I think this contrast between the effective cybernetics and ambitious cybernetics has come up in other terms earlier in the book, where he's talked about how many of the sort of devices and explanations that cyberneticians propose for different phenomena are very interesting and make important contributions to our understanding of that phenomenon. But then there's a kind of like second step where they like extrapolate from that to saying that this mechanistic process, this mechanical tortoise or whatever, sort of accounts for the capacity for living beings in general, or for mental life in general. So that they sort of go from the fact that you can learn something about this specific biological phenomenon by building a mechanical model that sort of simulates it. They go from that to therefore all life is really just this similar. It is similar in nature to this mechanical model. It's all just these interacting machines, and that's obviously not a very good inference. That just because you can make a model of a certain biological phenomenon in mechanical terms doesn't mean that life as such is sort of explicable in mechanical terms. It doesn't mean that it's not. Like it could be the case that you can explain life as such in mechanical terms, but that just the fact that you build a mechanical tortoise doesn't really suffice to prove that. Yeah, and so there's this kind of gap between like what cyberneticians have actually accomplished and then what sort of lessons they draw from those accomplishments, which are generally much more ambitious sort of claims about the nature of life or the nature of mind than are warranted by their actual theoretical or experimental productions. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Yeah, so I can read this one. I think this should take us to the end of the chapter. Yeah, I'll read the end of the chapter. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm at the wrong. Okay. Remaining problems. We see three main ones. One, the Mayapsanian objection is not philosophically resolved. It seems that we have not succeeded in putting both types of theories of novelty, quote unquote, on an equal footing. In fact, by linking inventive information to a mixture of intentional consciousness and adjustment to the laws of physics, we fall into the first type of theory. Novelty was contained virtually in consciousness, the laws of physics, and the meaning and values aimed at by consciousness. We have therefore arrived at a theory which is not very different from that of the Timaeus. We have emphasized that the connections of passive assemblies were given in advance as conscious connections of the active assembly, that there was, in a sense, more in consciousness than in the substituted automation, and that the machine was only an extract from the unitas multiplex, that is, the field of consciousness, where all possible connections are virtually present. 2. Any dualism or philosophical pluralism is unsatisfactory. To allow several principles or distinct domains to coexist, it leaves things incompletely understood. But we have allowed the opposition of the world of meaning and of value in the spatio-temporal world to persist. We have also allowed to persist the opposition between psychobiological individuality and its guiding ideal. Finally, we have seen that inventive information in the atomic and microphysical domain is necessarily of a type very different to information at the level of quote-unquote secondary laws and macroscopic phenomena. The quote, natura non nisi parendo vincitur, cannot be applied in the same way to the manner in which a virus molecule finds a way to repair and reproduce itself by capturing more simple molecules, and to the manner in which the animal uses water or air for respiration by channeling it through the gills or the lungs, or to the way that man uses a current of air to power a windmill or an ejection of particles to propel a rocket. There are no real tubes or membranes in a virus, which is hardly more than a molecule. Without claiming to escape these difficulties, which are closely connected, we can note that they largely neutralize each other. The spatial-temporal world, where the macroscopic laws of physics reign, is not a type of matter like the primordial and adversarial matter of the old Gnostic dualism. It simply results from the multiplicity of individuals which are truly primary. The spatial world is only matter insofar as it is colonized or colonizable by those individuals who are more enterprising than others. Connections, linked arrangements, channels, and machines only appear when an enterprising colonizer, whose directly governed empire has already reached a significant order of magnitude, deals en masse with the subordinate crowd of individuals instead of annexing them in detail as it does at the level of microphysics. Respiration or assimilation in a large plant or animal for which air and water appear as material, a continuous current to be utilized, naturally prolong the molecular respiration or assimilation in which air and water play a role as ancillary molecules in a fully structured system. With matter only appearing with the progress of colonization and as an obstacle or an auxiliary treated en masse, the only remaining philosophical problem is the duality of agent to ideal. There's a agent arrow ideal here. But this duality is also created by the multiplicity of individuals. If there were only a single simple agent facing the ideal world, there could be no proper psychological consciousness. It would be as if absorbed into this ideal world in the way that, as the theologians say, a divine will is one with divine understanding. Psychological consciousness as a field of consciousness and not as a pure actualizing intention can also only be conceived as a secondary phenomenon. The typical field of consciousness is the visual field that, when I devise some information, when I write a letter or draw, appears to me first as a blank page. In order to have this field at my disposal, it is necessary that I have eyes formed of numerous sensory cells. The psychological expanse, quote unquote, upon which I draw the lines of my invention, controlling myself according to the ideal envisioned, corresponds to the physical world, which itself requires a multiplicity of individuals. Yet it is in consciousness as a field that possibilities and possible connections appear to be inscribed in advance. It is in relation to this consciousness field that the substituted connections of the machine appear to be only a simple extract from the unitas multiplex. Consciousness is only, quote-unquote, multiplex, secondarily to the colonization carried out by the original kind of, quote-unquote, unitas, conscious intention. Visual consciousness as a blank page for invention and information is already a mix of transspatial and spatial. The field of consciousness as psychological expanse corresponding to the space of the physical domain, quote-unquote, surveyed, is the result of a crossover between the non-physical, quote-unquote, dimension, where the, quote-unquote, I aims for the ideal, and the world of crowds and multitudes, which are to be informed and connected according to this ideal, but also according to their own functioning. This is why invention seems to be virtual and why the Mayachsonian objection seems to retain its force. But it is necessary to remark that this quote-unquote virtuality is very different to the naive quote-unquote virtuality that hides, as in a box, forms that would later emerge to appear in space. The quote absolute survey unquote of the blank page gives everything and gives nothing. It allows for invention but leaves everything to be invented. The meaning or themes that I glimpse in a strange quote-unquote nowhere or in an imaginary dimension beyond the blank page only roughly guide my pen in a way that seems frustrating to me, but it is precisely the place left for my real existence. The consciousness field is only equipped with a quote-unquote creativity that is a virtuality of the invention of forms and not a virtuality of forms. If I want to duplicate a square on a blank page, like the slave in Plato, I do not have an implicit reminiscence which could guide me. It is only through absolute survey that I can extend a straight line, trace auxiliary lines, notice some equivalence or inequivalence, and judge the evidence of failure or success according to my intention. In short, I can take initiatives that are at the same time free and yet conform to the range of possibilities in which these initiatives unfold themselves. Does the Meyersonian objection still apply to creativity itself? Is it just a word concealing the absence of a solution? It comes to the point where reason must give way to theology or metaphysics. Let's say then that this quote-unquote creativity of consciousness can only be conceived as a fragment of the cosmic creativity of what we have, thanks to cybernetics, defined as the absolute framing, the thread that traverses all individual conscious activities, themselves framing psychophysiological assemblies and auxiliary mechanisms. So it seems like the answer to the question of how my sensitivity to values interacts with the machines that make up my body is that we're all part of this one universal creativity that is sort of interacting with itself in this differentiated way, which maybe is not entirely convincing as an answer, given that you're sort of explaining something hard to understand by something that seems even harder to understand. But anyway, it's at least an interesting picture to present of an alternate way of depicting this problem. So I think maybe like the sort of reframing of this problem is more, so it's not a question of, how do values interact with, matter, or the how does the transspatial world interact with the spatial world. It's a question more of how do these different true forms that are, performing this sort of actualization, how do they interact with each other? Because when, for example, I as a person, make a certain movement, I decide to pick up the coffee cup, I'm sort of bringing about transformations of the different cells in, my nervous system and my muscles and so on. And then at an even smaller scale, there's, the movement of molecules across the cell membranes that bring about those changes. And you can keep going down the scale. So, my action of picking up the coffee cup is brought about by, all these other actions of the cells and the molecules and so on that make up my body. And then the question is, like, how do all these, actions of these cells and molecules and so on get linked up to each other in such a way as to constitute the movement of my arm? So yeah, I guess the question is sort of moved away from this, what he describes as this Gnostic picture of, like, matter and mind sort of confronting each other in this duality, and more to a question of, how do the actions of these forms get linked up in such a way that, the molecules move in such a way to make the cells move in this way that make my arm move in this way. That's a sort of, it's a different type of question, but it's still a difficult question, I think, of, how these forms that are actualizing an ideal are connected with each other. And yeah, maybe we're back to the Leibniz monadology question of, how do the monads coordinate with each other?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this in Simondonian terms, and just try to think about how Ruyer and Simondon would line up. And obviously, for Simondon, an individuation is the resolution of partial and ongoing resolution of the tensions in pre-individual milieu. So Simondon, if we see Simondon's thesis in these kind of Leibnizian terms, of the terms Ruyer uses, the kind of elements of the pre-individual milieu would be, at least in part, kind of what become the dominated monads, I guess, of Ruyer's true form, which itself would be the ongoing process of individuation. But I don't think that Simondon does talk about individuation as kind of like an axiological resolution sometimes, but except at the level of psychic individuation, I don't think Simondon would see there being this kind of first person, feedback between the true form or the individuation and this transspatial realm of values. So still a bit obscure how that would line up, but at least, yeah, to me, Simondon's account is better at maybe explaining how the individual could relate to what it, that out of which it individuates in the first place, without resorting to like a Leibnizian metaphysical harmony principle.
Yeah, I think if we were to sort of juxtapose Ruyer and Simondon, like I think for Ruyer, ultimately it's all just individuals, sort of all the way down, and then the only sort of differentiation is like how many other individuals are being coordinated by a certain individual, in the sense that to go back to the coffee cup example, that my action of picking up the coffee cup involves coordinating the actions of these countless individuals that make up the cells and molecules and so on in my arm. um, um, and yeah, so you're sort of starting from the individuals. It's a kind of atomism in that sense, or again, the monadology, where like, yeah, the monads are already there. You're not sort of accounting for their individuation. Where does a monad come from? You're just sort of starting from the existence of the monads and then using them to explain all these other phenomena. And I think you can maybe also suggest that Ruyer sort of falls under the criticism of the hylomorphic schema that Simondon presents, in that you have this form which is being imposed on the matter, which in as he's explained here, the matter is itself sort of subordinate forms, like the molecules that are subordinated to the form of the cell. But we're still left with this sort of obscure zone in the middle of how exactly the form of the cell is imposed on those molecules. And yeah, so I think I think we are still left with a kind of obscure zone in Ruyer's work, even if he wants to sort of disperse that obscure zone, among all these different forms or monads that are sort of making up all these entities.
Yeah, that's a great point, and maybe this difficulty with the relationship between monads and is related to this. One of the reasons maybe it's difficult to understand how dominant monad can have any relationship to dominated monads is because it's not clear how the dominant can come about in the first place. It seems to me that for Simondon, ultimately, I mean, there's a kind of similarity in that I think that for Simondon, everything that is a kind of unification, a process of individuation. But yeah, as you noted, the difference is that obviously Simondon's whole philosophy is the philosophy of individuation, the production of these individuals as ongoing process of resolution. Well, I guess I would have to clarify. It's not just the individuals, but the individual as process plus but I guess similar in that everything in a sense comes down to individuals, but individuals as processes. Different in the sense that the individuals come about this individuation process in the first place, and are not sort of reducible to when they're individual.
Yeah, I think we've talked before about how like it would be very interesting to do like an in-depth sort of analysis of this, Bergson, Ruyer, Simondon, Merleau-Ponty kind of lineage or school in a sort of broad sense, and try to disentangle what elements they share and where they are opposed to each other. I don't know of anyone who's actually sort of done that project, though of course there are people who have done parts of it. But yeah, it would be very interesting to work out all those connections and differences, in terms of what there are a lot of, I think, similar questions that they're asking, but they each, of course, approach them in different ways and give different answers to those questions. Okay, so I think we can go on to we finished the chapter, but the next bit is like a 2-page conclusion of the first edition. So maybe we can go on to that one as well.
That sounds good. I can read. Chapter 9, Summary and Conclusion to the First. This work may appear to be mainly critical and negative. We have indeed attempted to argue that the mechanist postulates of cybernetics are both logically and experimentally. Taken literally, they lead to the absurdity of a quote-unquote perpetual motion of the third kind. And on the other hand, they clash with the facts. These facts reveal that all information machines, as much as ordinary machines, are always framed by a conscious and meaningful activity. A machine is never more than an ensemble of auxiliary connections set up by that improviser of connections, which is consciousness. Information as the communication of meaning is only a particular case of information as the creation of. All authentic anti-chance derives from connections, and all connection derives from consciousness. Turning to the machine in order to dispel the mystery of anti-chance and of the origin of information is then contradictory. Organic and psychological information, the organized and meaningful epigenesis of structures in memory and invention, cannot be explained mechanically. The failure of cybernetics to understand the origin of information and anti-chance, and the purely apparent and superficial character of the success of its mechanical models, when it claims to understand the perception of universals, learning, communication between individuals, and the sense of time, are proof of the fallacious character of its mechanist postulates. But to critique these postulates is not to critique or diminish cybernetics itself. Cybernetics represents one of the most remarkable advances in contemporary techniques, science, and philosophy. With the mechanist postulates abandoned, we are not faced with cybernetics minus something. On the contrary, we have cybernetics plus, a powerful procedure for exploring the problems of life and consciousness, and for understanding the mode of attachment of structures and meaning of physical space in the transspatial. The study of feedback mechanisms leads to a definition of axiological feedback and regulation, which sets up and envelops the feedback mechanisms, and of the axiological quote-unquote space that envelops physical space. It allows the definition of the generalized dynamics of which Leibniz and Cournot dreamed, without having had the means of establishing it with sufficient precision. Yeah, pretty straightforward conclusion. We've talked about how he's not saying we should sort of do away with cybernetics, only that we should be skeptical of the kind of unwarranted inferences that cyberneticians sometimes make. I guess the only thing I would add is that this, talked about this before, but this seems to be kind of characteristic of the posture of the philosophers you just mentioned, Merleau-Ponty, Simondon, Ruyer, I would argue Bergson as well, that they aren't anti-mechanistic or they aren't somehow opposed to science, but see it as practically necessary and intellectually extremely useful thinking philosophical problems as well.
Yeah, we've talked about the sort of reputation of Bergson as being this sort of like anti-rationalist, that it's all about just sort of like vibes, that you just sort of like enjoy your intuition of duration and so on. And obviously that's not a very good reading of Bergson. If you actually read his works, he's very clearly looking at like there's the example in creative evolution of the wasp and so on. He's like looking at biological studies and not just saying, oh, it's all just this élan vital that sort of mysteriously does everything, which is sort of like the caricature of his position. And I think maybe to that grouping of philosophers we could also add Canguilhem a little bit, and, a different, maybe not quite as closely aligned with them, but like again there's this kind of rationalist vitalism where he's very sympathetic to some of the mechanistic biologists that he's presenting, whose work he's studying, but at the same time saying that living beings are machines doesn't really get you anywhere unless you can identify what kind of machines they are. Obviously a dog or a tree or whatever is not the same, not identical to a car. There's some difference about certain machines that make them living beings and then other ones that are not living beings. And so identifying the sort of mechanical character of some of the processes and structures that make up a dog or a tree or whatever can teach you a lot about how these beings function and maintain themselves in existence and so on. But you're still left with a big question of what is it about some of these machines or beings that are made up of machines that makes them alive. And so there's this sort of vitalism as like a kind of insistence on keeping that question open, I guess, in the sense that you don't sort of allow yourself to slide from we've identified these machines within an organism to therefore organisms in general are just machines, and there's no sort of further question to ask. And so it's in that sense that this is a kind of rationalist vitalism, because you're vitalist not in the sense that you just sort of try to explain away some phenomenon by appealing to this vital force as a sort of caricature of vitalism claims, but you're a vitalist in the sense that you sort of hold on to the difference between living and non-living, and don't allow yourself to sort of paper over that difference by just pointing to the presence of these mechanisms within a living being. And so I think that's like maybe one of the key sort of features that all of these authors share, is that sort of refusal to allow themselves to ignore the difference. Just because there are mechanisms within living beings doesn't mean that that's all that a living being is, or that we've sort of captured what it is to be a living being just by pointing to mechanisms. I'm going to suggest that we stop here for today, given that we're at a chapter break again, and also I have not had breakfast. So it's going to be a short session, if that's okay. And then the next bit is, so we did have a conclusion today, but we have a sort of postscript that he adds to the second edition in 1967. So it's I guess 9 years later. And of course, there's been a lot of development in the world of cybernetics, computers, and so on during this time period. And so he kind of looks back on to what extent those developments sort of change his what effect they have on his ideas that he's presented in the first edition. And it's quite long, if I remember correctly. It's like 50 pages or so. So it'll be several more weeks that we will be going through this postscript. Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for coming out. We're, as I mentioned, we're on the last postscript chapter, so we can maybe start thinking about what we want to read next. But we still have several weeks to get through that. But something to ponder in the coming weeks.
It sounds good. Thanks everyone. See you next week.